I am at gate B7. Did you hear that?
$7 billion investment.
We are clearing this plane for takeoff. Now.
They didn't lower their voices. They didn't pull him aside. "Sir, you need to come with us right now." The words landed hard, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A glass of water froze halfway to someone's lips. Even the soft overhead hum seemed to thin out. Ethan Brooks looked up slowly. He didn't react the way people expected. No panic, no anger. Just a quiet pause. 48 years old. Dark blazer, white shirt, no tie. The kind of man who traveled often but never tried to look important. Two airline employees stood beside seat 2A. One wore a navy blazer with a badge clipped too high. The other held a small radio, thumb resting on the button like he was waiting for permission to press it. "Is there a problem?" Ethan asked. His voice was steady, even. The man with the badge didn't meet his eyes. "We need to verify something with you. It'll just take a moment. Then do it here," Ethan said. "I have my boarding pass." A shift rippled through the cabin. People looked, then looked away. A woman across the aisle leaned back in her seat, pretending to fix her scarf. A man near the window pulled out his phone, not recording, just holding it like it gave him something to do. No one spoke. Ethan noticed all of it. He always did. "I'd prefer you step off the aircraft with us," the second man said. Not louder, just firmer. That was when it became clear. This wasn't a request. Ethan closed the tablet on his lap. Slow, careful. He placed it inside his leather bag like he had all the time in the world, but inside, something tightened. He had boarded early. Group 1 first class, seat 2A. The system had accepted his ticket. The gate agent barely glanced at him. Now suddenly, something needed verifying. He stood up, not because he agreed, because he understood. There are moments in life when arguing only feeds the wrong story. And there are moments when silence shows more. "Do you mind telling me what this is about?" he asked as he stepped into the aisle. No answer. The man with the badge simply gestured forward. Ethan nodded once. As he turned, he caught it, a voice behind him. Low. Sharp. I knew something was off. He didn't need to look, but he did anyway. Row 2C. A woman in a cream sweater, mid-50s. Polished, confident in the way some people are when they've never been questioned. She dropped her eyes the second he looked at her, too late. He had already seen it, the assumption. Ethan picked up his bag and walked forward. Step by step, past seats that suddenly felt narrower, past people who had opinions but no words. Past the flight attendant who forced a smile and looked right through him. The aircraft door opened. Cool air rushed in from the jet bridge. And just like that, he was no longer a passenger. He was a situation. Outside, the sound changed. Less controlled. More real steps echoed. A cart rattled somewhere down the corridor. They stopped near the wall. Name? The man with the badge asked. Ethan Brooks. Where are you traveling today? New York. Purpose of your trip? Ethan shifted his bag to his other hand. Work. What kind of work? The question lingered longer than the others. Ethan watched him now, really watched him. Meetings, he said. With who? A pause. Not long, but enough. With your company, Ethan said. The man blinked. Just once. What do you mean by that? Ethan adjusted his jacket. Small movement. Controlled. I have a meeting with North Star Airlines executive board tomorrow morning. The second man let out a breath that almost sounded like disbelief. And your role in that meeting? Ethan held his gaze. I'm the one funding it. Silence. Not loud. Not dramatic. But different. The kind that shifts the air. The man with the badge looked at his partner, then back at Ethan. Something had changed. Just slightly, but enough to matter. Do you have anything to confirm that? He asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, unlocked it, turned the screen toward them. An email thread. Names. Titles, numbers that didn't need explanation. Investment pending. Signature. $7 billion. The second man leaned in closer now, closer than before, reading faster than he meant to. Neither of them spoke. For a moment, the noise of the terminal faded. There it was, the truth. Quiet, clear, and completely ignored just minutes earlier. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. Are we done? He asked. No one answered right away, because now the question wasn't about verification. It was about something much harder. What happens when you realize you were wrong, and everyone saw it? The taller officer cleared his throat again, softer this time, like he was trying to step back from something he had already stepped into. Well, it looks like everything checks out, he said. Checks out? Ethan nodded once. He didn't smile. He didn't push. He just stood there, steady, waiting for the next decision. The second officer shifted his stance, glancing toward the open aircraft door. Toward the cabin. Toward the place where all of this had started. "You're good to return to your seat, sir," he said. "Sir," that word had changed. Ethan picked up his bag, no rush, no hesitation. Just control. He turned and walked back. The jet bridge echoed under his steps. Same path, same distance, but the air felt different now. Heavier, charged with something unspoken. At the doorway, the flight attendant stepped aside. "Quickly, too quickly, welcome back," she said. Her voice was careful, measured. Ethan didn't respond. He walked in. Heads lifted again. Not as quickly this time, not as openly, but they looked. The man in the aisle seat across from him straightened his back, suddenly interested in nothing at all. A woman near the window pressed her lips together, eyes fixed on the seat in front of her. Row 2C, the woman in the cream sweater. She didn't look up. Her hand gripped her coffee cup tighter than before. The lid bent slightly under the pressure. A thin line of liquid trembled near the edge. Ethan paused for half a second beside his seat, just enough. Not to embarrass her, not to confront her, but to exist there, fully. Then he sat down, placed his bag under the seat, opened his tablet, the same movements as before. But nothing was the same. The plane door closed with a dull, final sound, a soft click that sealed everything inside. The captain's voice came on again, steady and calm, like nothing had happened. "We'll be departing shortly. No mention, no explanation, just forward, always forward." Ethan leaned back in his seat, looked at the screen, rows of numbers, charts, projections. All the work that had led to this moment, $7 billion, a deal that would reshape an entire division of the airline. He had built that, piece by piece, late nights, quiet meetings, rooms where people questioned him before they listened. He had answered with results, always results. Across the aisle, the man in the grey suit finally spoke, low, almost to himself. Something. Ethan heard it. Didn't look up. A few rows back, someone whispered, "They pulled him off?" Another voice, softer, "I think so." Then silence again. The kind that comes after people realize they watched something they don't fully understand. Ethan reached for his phone, unlocked it. The screen lit up his face for a moment. He opened his email. Scrolled to the thread. North Star Airlines, Executive Board, his meeting tomorrow morning. He read the names again, people who had already decided what he was worth, on paper. Not in person. He tapped forward. Typed one name, Clara Benson, General Counsel. His thumb paused. Then he began. Short lines, direct, removed from aircraft prior to departure, no explanation provided, reinstated after verification of identity and business relationship. He stopped, looked up. The cabin felt smaller now, quieter, not peaceful, controlled. He continued. This is not a surface issue. This is a systemic failure. He read it once. No emotion in the words, but the meaning was there. He hit send. The message disappeared, just like that. He opened another. This time to the partnerships team. We need to revisit terms. No greeting, no closing. Send. The engines began to rise in pitch. A low vibration spread through the floor. Movement. Finally, Ethan placed the phone face down on the tray. Looked out the window. Ground crew moving in practiced patterns. Signals. Timing. Precision. Everything looked efficient. From the outside, that was the thing about systems. They worked perfectly, until they didn't. Until someone decided the rules didn't apply the same way to everyone. The flight attendant returned with his water. No ice. She placed it gently on the tray. Her hand lingered for a fraction of a second. "I'm sorry for earlier," she says, but barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at her, really looked. There was something there now, not fear. Not guilt, awareness, that was different. He nodded once, not accepting, not rejecting, just acknowledging. She stepped away. The plane began to roll. Slow at first, then steady. Ethan picked up the glass, took a small sip, set it back down. He closed his eyes for a moment. To decide, because this wasn't about a seat, it never was. It was about what happens when people confuse comfort with control, when they mistake silence for agreement, when they think no one will push back. Ethan opened his eyes, reached for his phone again, scrolled to a contact he hadn't planned to use until tomorrow, Daniel Harper, Chief Executive Officer, North Star Airlines. His finger hovered, then pressed. The line rang once, twice, then connected. "Ethan," the voice said, confident, unaware. Looking forward to tomorrow, Ethan stared straight ahead. The runway stretched wide in front of them, clear, open, no turning back. "We need to talk," he said, and this time there was no pause on his end at all. Daniel Harper did not speak for several seconds. The only sound on the line was the distant murmur of an office, and the low rumble of the aircraft beginning its taxi. Finally, he said, "You don't usually call me before a meeting. Is everything all right?" Ethan watched the runway lights slide past the window. "No," he answered. "It isn't." Daniel's tone changed immediately. "What happened?" "I was removed from your flight before departure." Silence. Then a quiet breath. "I'm sorry. Removed? For what reason? That's the question I'm hoping your airline can answer." Daniel did not interrupt. Ethan appreciated that. Too many people rushed to explain before they understood. "They said they needed to verify my identity," Ethan continued. "They asked me to leave my seat in front of an entire first-class cabin. They questioned me in the jet bridge. Only after I showed them who I was did they decide I could come back." Another pause. "That should never have happened," Daniel said. "No," Ethan replied. "It shouldn't have." The engines grew louder beneath the cabin floor. Flight attendants took their seats. The aircraft turned onto the runway. Daniel lowered his voice. "Were you threatened?" "No." "Touched?" "No." "Were you arrested?" "No." Daniel sighed. "That almost makes it harder." Ethan looked out the window as the aircraft stopped for final clearance. "It does. Because people will call it a misunderstanding." "Yes, and they'll expect you to move on." Yes, Daniel was quiet again. He had spent more than 30 years in aviation. He knew the difference between a legal problem and a leadership problem. This was both. "I want every detail when you land," Daniel said. "You'll have it." "And Ethan?" "Yes, I'm sorry." This time the apology sounded real. Not rehearsed, not written by a communications department, just one human being speaking to another. "I know," Ethan said before ending the call. The aircraft accelerated. The force pushed everyone gently back into their seats. Outside, the runway blurred into streaks of grey and white. Then the wheels lifted. The city fell away beneath them. Inside the cabin, conversation slowly returned. The woman across the aisle finally looked at Ethan, just for a moment. Then she leaned toward the flight attendant when she passed. "Excuse me?" The attendant stopped. "Yes, ma'am, I think I may have caused all this." The attendant remained still. The woman swallowed. "I told someone he didn't seem like he belonged in first class." Her voice had lost its confidence. "I wasn't trying to get anyone removed." The attendant answered carefully. "I understand." "No," the woman whispered. "I don't think you do." She stared at the tray table in front of her. "My father taught me to judge people by how they treated others." She laughed once, a dry, embarrassed sound. "And somewhere along the way, I stopped doing that." The attendant didn't know what to say, neither did anyone nearby. Ethan heard every word. He did not turn around. He wasn't interested in humiliation. Embarrassment alone never changed people. Honest reflection sometimes did. The flight attendant walked toward the galley. Her shoulders were tense. Another attendant joined her. "Are you okay?" the younger woman asked quietly. She nodded. "Not really. What happened out there?" "We followed a passenger complaint." "And?" She looked back toward first class. "We never stopped to ask whether the complaint itself made sense." The younger attendant frowned. "So we trusted the assumption?" "Yes." Neither woman spoke again. The realization was enough. Ethan opened his laptop. Not to work. To write while the memory was fresh. He created a blank document. No dramatic language, no accusations, just facts. Time of boarding, seat assignment. Questions asked, names remembered, words spoken, how every person reacted. He knew memories faded. Documents did not. Across the aisle, the man in the grey suit leaned over. "Sir?" Ethan looked up. "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything." I sat here and watched. The man looked ashamed. I knew it felt wrong. But I didn't say a word. Ethan studied his face. Late 60s, wedding ring worn smooth, hands marked by years of work, an ordinary man, not cruel, just afraid of becoming involved. "That happens more often than people admit," Ethan said. "I should have spoken." "Yes," Ethan answered honestly. The man nodded. "I will next time." Ethan believed him, not because the promise was dramatic, because it was difficult. Real change rarely began with grand speeches. Sometimes it began with one ordinary person deciding that silence was no longer acceptable. Ethan closed the laptop. Outside, clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft. Bright, calm. Inside, however, the day had already changed. Not because he had been questioned. Not because people now knew who he was, but because a simple act of prejudice had revealed something much larger. A company could lose money and recover, it could survive bad headlines. But if it stopped seeing people as individuals, every decision after that became a risk. And Ethan was no longer thinking only as the passenger in seat 2A. He was thinking as the investor who had the power to decide whether North Star Airlines deserved the future they were asking him to help build. The flight landed in New York just after noon. The touchdown was smooth, no applause, no conversation about what had happened before takeoff. People reached for their bags as if the morning had been ordinary. Ethan stayed seated. He had learned years ago that the first people to stand were rarely the first people to leave. He watched the aisle fill with impatience. Phones came out, briefcases dropped from overhead bins. Someone laughed about missing a connection. Life moved on. For most of the passengers, the incident was already becoming a story they would tell over dinner. For Ethan, it had just begun. When the row ahead finally cleared, he stood and lifted his bag from the overhead compartment. The flight attendant who had apologized earlier was waiting near the aircraft door. Her smile was gone. Only sincerity remained. "Mr. Brooks." He stopped. "I want to apologize again." Ethan nodded politely. "I appreciate that." She hesitated. "I've been with this airline for almost 20 years. Her voice trembled slightly. "I've always believed I treated every passenger fairly." She looked down before continuing. "Today made me question whether believing that was enough." Ethan answered gently. "Sometimes the hardest lesson isn't discovering we're bad people." She looked up. "It's discovering we stopped asking ourselves the right questions." She blinked several times, holding back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. He offered a small nod and walked into the terminal. The airport was alive with movement. Rolling suitcases echoed across polished floors. Children hurried after exhausted parents. Business travelers walked with practice speed, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. Ethan blended into the crowd, exactly as he preferred. Outside, a black sedan waited near the passenger pickup area. A driver stepped forward. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." "Good afternoon, Samuel." Samuel opened the rear door. Once inside, he glanced into the mirror. "You look tired." Ethan loosened his jacket. "I've had a longer morning than expected." Samuel smiled. "I figured as much." They pulled away from the terminal. Traffic crawled toward the freeway. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Samuel had worked for Ethan for almost 10 years. He understood that silence often carried more truth than questions. Finally, Ethan said, "Have you ever walked into a room and realized someone had already decided who you were?" Samuel let out a quiet breath. "I'm a black man in America," he smiled sadly. "So yes." The answer hung between them. No explanation needed. "I thought things were changing," Ethan said. "They are," Samuel replied. "But change isn't a straight line." The city passed outside the window. Bridges, warehouses, neighborhoods, built by generations of people who had all believed tomorrow could be better than today. Ethan stared outside. "I keep wondering what would have happened if I wasn't me." Samuel understood immediately. "If you weren't the investor, if I were a school teacher, a retired veteran, a mechanic, a grandfather flying home." Samuel nodded. They probably would have accepted the apology and gone home carrying something invisible. Neither man spoke after that. The silence felt honest. By the time they reached Midtown Manhattan, Ethan's phone had filled with messages. Clara Benson, Daniel Harper, members of his executive team, the board of Brooks Capital. Every message asked the same question in different words. "Are you all right?" He answered only one. "To Clara, please move tomorrow's meeting to this afternoon. Urgent." Within 30 seconds she called. "You want to move the meeting forward?" "Yes. Is this about the flight?" "It is." Her voice sharpened. "Should I notify legal? They'll be there. Public relations?" "Not yet." "Media, no." She paused. "You already know what you're going to do. I know what I'm going to ask. And if they refuse?" Ethan looked through the car window at the North Star Airlines headquarters appearing in the distance. Glass. Steel. Confidence. Then he answered quietly. "Then I'll know exactly who they are." Samuel pulled the sedan to the curb. Security staff opened the front entrance. Executives in tailored suits crossed the lobby carrying folders and coffee. Inside that building, people believed they were preparing for the biggest investment meeting in the company's history. None of them knew the agenda had changed. Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk. He looked up at the building for a long moment. Money had brought him here, But money would not decide what happened next. Respect would. And if respect could not be found inside those walls, neither would his investment. The conference room overlooked the Manhattan skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the space with afternoon light. Glass towers reflected one another across the city. Inside, everything looked polished, quiet, controlled. A long walnut table stretched across the room. Coffee cups waited beside leather folders. Presentation screens glowed with charts predicting growth, revenue, and expansion. Daniel Harper stood as Ethan entered. He crossed the room with his hand extended. "Ethan, thank you for coming in early." Ethan shook his hand. "Thank you for making the time." Daniel studied his face. "You've had a difficult morning." "I have." The other executives sensed the change immediately. Margaret Lewis, the chief legal officer, closed the folder in front of her. David Kim, head of operations, lowered his coffee without taking another sip. Nobody mentioned contracts. Not yet. Daniel gestured toward the seat at the head of the table. "Before we begin, I want to apologize personally." Ethan remained standing. "I appreciate that." Daniel waited. "So tell us what happened." The room became completely still. Ethan did not exaggerate. He did not raise his voice. He simply told the truth from boarding, to the complaint, to being escorted into the jet bridge, to the questions, to the moment everything changed after they learned who he was. No one interrupted. No one looked at their phone. When he finished, the silence felt heavier than any speech. Margaret finally spoke. "Was anyone physically aggressive?" "No." "Were you denied boarding?" "No." She nodded slowly. "So the real issue is how you were treated before anyone knew your identity." Ethan looked directly at her. "The real issue is that my identity should never have mattered." Those words settled over the room. David leaned back in his chair. "I've worked in aviation for almost 30 years. He rubbed his forehead. "We spend millions talking about customer experience." He looked toward Daniel, and somehow we missed the first step. Daniel folded his hands. "Dignity." David nodded. "Dignity." No one argued. Because there was nothing to argue with. Daniel took a slow breath. "I've already instructed our internal review team to begin investigating." Ethan remained calm. "I expected that. We'll identify everyone involved. I expected that too." Daniel frowned slightly. "What are you asking to his briefcase?" He removed a thin folder. No dramatic motion, no performance. He slid it across the table. Daniel opened it. Inside was only one page. At the top, in plain black letters, were 3 words. "Culture before contracts." Daniel looked up. Ethan spoke quietly. "I didn't come here to discuss punishment." Margaret glanced toward the page. "I came here because your airline has a leadership problem." The room remained silent. Ethan continued. "If this could happen to me, someone with every document, every credential, every resource, then imagine the passenger who has none of those things." David lowered his eyes. A retired teacher, a military veteran, a young nurse, a grandfather visiting family, any one of them could have walked into the same situation. Without influence, without a direct line to the chief executive officer, without anyone listening afterward. Daniel slowly closed the folder. "What would you like us to do?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I want independent bias training designed by outside experts." He raised one finger. "I want passenger complaints involving discrimination reviewed by leadership instead of being buried in reports." A second finger. "I want frontline employees empowered to question assumptions instead of automatically acting on them." A third. "And I want public accountability." Nobody wrote anything down. They were listening too carefully. Margaret broke the silence. "Those are significant requests. They're necessary requests." Daniel nodded once. "And the investment?" Ethan looked through the glass toward the skyline. For a long moment, no one knew what he would say. Finally, he turned back. "The investment can wait." Every face in the room changed. Not dramatically, just enough. $7 billion. Delayed not because of financial risk, because of values. Daniel leaned forward. "You're willing to postpone the largest agreement in our company's history?" Ethan met his eyes. "I'm willing to postpone any agreement until I'm convinced your culture deserves your future." No one spoke. The city continued moving outside the windows. Traffic flowed. People hurried through crosswalks. Life continued. Inside the boardroom, however, every projection on every screen suddenly felt meaningless. Revenue could be rebuilt. Markets could recover. Stock prices could rise again. Trust was different. Trust had to be earned. And for the first time that afternoon, everyone around the table understood they were no longer negotiating with an investor. They were being measured by the kind of people they had chosen to become. Daniel looked around the room before speaking. "I don't want a prepared response." His voice was calm. "I want honest ones." No one reached for the talking points sitting inside the leather folders. No one opened a laptop. For the first time that afternoon, titles mattered less than character. Margaret was the first to answer. "We focused on policy," she said. "We assumed policy would guarantee fairness." She looked directly at Ethan. "It doesn't," David nodded. "It only guarantees consistency." He paused. "If the judgment is flawed, the policy simply repeats the flaw." The words lingered. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I've spent years telling shareholders that our people are our greatest asset." He shook his head once. "This morning we failed one person," Ethan answered quietly. "You failed more than one." Every eye turned toward him. "You failed every employee who watched it happen and believed they couldn't question the decision," he continued. "You failed every passenger who saw it and wondered whether it could happen to them." Another pause. "And you failed every manager who was never taught the difference between following procedure and exercising judgment. No one defended the company, because no defense would have sounded honest." Margaret folded her hands. "What if we publicly acknowledge everything?" Ethan looked at her. "Would you have done that if I were a retired school principal instead of an investor?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. That silence answered for her. Daniel slowly stood and walked toward the window. The city stretched beneath him. Millions of people. Millions of stories. Some would never be heard. He spoke without turning around. "When I joined this company, my father gave me one piece of advice." He smiled sadly. He said, "Airlines don't just transport people." The room waited. "They transport trust." He looked back at the table. "And trust is impossible to recover once people believe you see them as less than human." Ethan nodded. "That's why this meeting matters." Daniel returned to his seat. "I accept every recommendation you've made." Margaret looked toward him. "We'll need board approval," David added quietly. "Implementation won't be quick." "I know. It could take years," Daniel answered without hesitation. "Then we'll spend years." The atmosphere shifted, not because anyone believed the problem was solved, because someone had finally accepted ownership. Clara Benson entered the room carrying a tablet. She apologized for interrupting. "Daniel, there's something you need to see." She placed the tablet on the table. A short video filled the screen. Shaky footage, recorded from several rows behind first class. The moment Ethan had been escorted into the aisle, no narration, no dramatic music, only real voices. One passenger whispering, another asking what was happening, someone quietly saying, "He hasn't done anything." The recording ended. The room stayed silent. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Has this been posted?" Clara nodded. "About 30 minutes ago." "How many views?" It started spreading quickly. She looked down at the updated numbers. Several 100,000 already. No one reacted to the number itself. Everyone understood what mattered. The story was no longer private. David looked at Ethan. "You didn't release this." "No, I didn't think you did." Margaret asked, "Have reporters contacted you?" "My office has received requests. Will you respond?" Ethan thought for a moment. "No." Daniel looked surprised. I could. You'd have every right. I know." Daniel waited. Ethan folded his hands on the table. "I'm not interested in winning today's news cycle." He spoke slowly. "I'm interested in changing tomorrow's decisions." The room became still again. Those words carried more weight than any public statement. Daniel looked toward Clara. "Prepare a public acknowledgement." She nodded. "No excuses." She nodded again. "No language written by lawyers trying to avoid responsibility." Margaret smiled faintly. "I can live with that," Daniel continued. "I want empathy." He looked around the table. "And I want action attached to every sentence." Clara left immediately. The door closed behind her. Ethan gathered his papers. Daniel noticed. "Are you leaving?" "For today." "What happens next at him? That depends on what your company does after I walk out." Daniel stood. "So the investment remains on hold, yes, but it isn't gone." Daniel extended his hand. "This morning my airline judged a man before learning his name." Ethan looked at the offered hand. "This afternoon I'm asking you not to judge an entire company before we earn another chance." For a brief moment neither man moved. Then Ethan shook his hand, firm, respectful. Nothing more, nothing less. As Ethan walked toward the elevator, employees in the hallway glanced up from their conversations. Most had no idea what had happened upstairs. They only saw two men leaving a meeting. One happened to be the chief executive officer. The other looked like any ordinary businessman carrying a worn leather briefcase. No one in that hallway could see the real weight inside it. It wasn't contracts. It wasn't money. It was a decision that could determine whether one of the country's largest airlines would become an example of meaningful change, or another company that confused an apology with accountability. By the next morning, the story had spread far beyond the airport. Not because anyone knew Ethan Brooks, but because people recognized the moment, passengers being questioned, a quiet man asked to leave his seat, an entire cabin watching, and almost no one speaking. The video had been shared thousands of times overnight. Most comments focused on the same question. What made someone believe he did not belong there? Ethan read only a handful before closing the screen. He had no interest in arguing with strangers. He cared far more about what people inside the company would do. At 8 o'clock, Clara Benson entered his office carrying a stack of printed reports. "You should see these." Ethan looked up from his desk. She placed the papers in front of him. Customer complaints, employee emails, anonymous reports, all submitted after the video became public. "I thought this was one incident," Clara said quietly. "So did I, it wasn't." Ethan began reading. A retired army sergeant described being repeatedly asked whether he was sitting in the correct cabin, despite holding a valid boarding pass. A Latina physician wrote about being mistaken for cleaning staff while waiting in an airport lounge. An elderly Asian couple explained how another passenger questioned whether they understood their boarding group. Different people, different cities, different years, the same feeling. Being treated like they needed to prove they belonged. Ethan closed the folder. "This isn't about one employee. No, it's about habits." Clara nodded. The kind nobody notices until someone finally says something. Before either of them could continue, Ethan's assistant knocked lightly. "Mr. Brooks, yes? Daniel Harper is here." Ethan checked the clock. The meeting wasn't scheduled until later. "Send him in." Daniel entered alone. No legal team, no communications director, no assistants. He carried only a thin folder. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You aren't." Daniel remained standing. I didn't want to wait. He placed the folder on Ethan's desk. "Our board met before sunrise." Ethan looked at the folder but did not open it. Daniel continued, "We unanimously approved every recommendation you made." He slid another document forward, and we added several of our own. Ethan opened the first page. Independent Review Panel. Mandatory Leadership Accountability. Revised Passenger Intervention Procedures. Anonymous reporting protections for employees outside audits every year. He turned another page. Scholarships. Community partnerships. Leadership performance tied to culture metrics. Nothing on the page looked rushed. Someone had worked all night. "You moved quickly," Ethan said. Daniel nodded. "We didn't move because of the headlines." He paused. "We moved because, after reading those internal reports, I realized this wasn't the company I believed I was leading." There was no defensiveness in his voice, only disappointment, the difficult kind, the honest kind. Ethan leaned back. "What changed your mind?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "I stopped asking how this happened to you." He took a slow breath and started asking how many people it happened to before you. The room fell quiet. Clara looked toward Daniel with new respect. That question changed everything. Daniel sat down across from Ethan. "I also met with the two security officers." Ethan listened carefully. They admitted they never saw anything suspicious. They acted because of the complaint. They acted because they assumed the complaint deserved more trust than the passenger. Ethan nodded once. "That's exactly the problem." Daniel folded his hands. "They've accepted disciplinary action." Ethan remained silent. Daniel noticed. "You don't seem satisfied." "I'm not interested in punishment." "What are you interested in?" Ethan looked toward the window overlooking the city. "I want those officers to become part of the solution." Daniel frowned slightly. Ethan continued. "If they understand what happened and help train others not to repeat it, they'll do more good than if they're simply dismissed." Daniel stared at him for several seconds. "I wasn't expecting that. Most people think accountability means ending someone's career." He shook his head gently. "Real accountability changes behavior." Clara smiled quietly. It also changes culture. Daniel looked down at the folder. I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about leadership. He looked back up. I realized something uncomfortable. What was that? If my employees believed they had to choose between following procedure and protecting someone's dignity. He stopped. Then I trained them poorly. No one spoke. That sentence carried more weight than any public apology. Ethan finally closed the folder. The investment committee meets this afternoon. Daniel nodded. I haven't made my decision. I know that too. Daniel stood. But whatever you decide. He extended his hand again. Thank you for forcing us to become the company we claim to be. Ethan stood as well. He shook Daniel, no tension. This time they mutual respect. The contract was still unsigned. The investment was still uncertain. But something far more valuable had begun. Two men from very different backgrounds had proven that real leadership does not begin when everything goes right. It begins the moment someone has the courage to admit that something went terribly wrong and refuses to look away. The investment committee gathered just after lunch. The atmosphere was nothing like the previous day's meeting. No one rushed into financial projections. No one opened spreadsheets. The numbers could wait. Character came first. Around the table sat investors, board members, and senior advisors who had worked with Ethan Brooks for decades. They trusted his judgment. But they also expected him to separate emotion from business. Margaret Ellis, the committee chair, spoke first. We've reviewed the report. She folded her glasses and placed them on the table. The airline has responded faster than most companies would. Several people nodded. They've accepted responsibility. They've committed to measurable reforms. They've invited outside oversight. She looked directly at Ethan. The question now is whether we move forward. No one interrupted. Every eye settled on him. Ethan remained quiet for several moments. Then he spoke. This isn't a decision about punishment. The room stayed still. If I wanted revenge, this meeting would already be over. He paused. But revenge never builds better institutions. One of the board members leaned forward. Then what are we deciding? We're deciding whether accountability is real. He reached for the folder Daniel Harper had delivered that morning. Every commitment was organized, every deadline attached to a responsible executive, independent audits, employee protections, leadership evaluations, public reporting, nothing vague, nothing hidden. Ethan closed the folder again. I believe they're sincere. Several heads lifted. Margaret looked surprised. So you're recommending approval? Ethan slowly shook his head. Not today. Silence. One investor frowned. If you believe they're sincere, why wait? Ethan answered without hesitation. Because trust is built through actions, not promises. No one argued. The distinction was impossible to ignore. He continued. Culture doesn't change overnight. It changes one decision at a time. He looked around the room. I'm willing to continue the conversation, but I won't sign the agreement until I see those commitments become reality. Margaret wrote one sentence in her notebook. Trust requires evidence. She underlined it once. The committee voted unanimously. The investment would remain active. The negotiations would continue. The signature would wait. There were winners. There were no losers. Only responsibility. Later that afternoon, Daniel Harper received the decision in his office. He read every page carefully. When he reached the final paragraph, he leaned back in his chair. His assistant watched him quietly. Bad news? Daniel looked up. No, she waited. It's the fairest decision we could have received. He stood and walked toward the window. If he had walked away immediately, he stopped. We might have blamed him if he had signed immediately. He shook his head. We might have learned nothing. His assistant smiled. So now the responsibility stays with us. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Across the country, inside airport break rooms and crew lounges, employees watched the company's public address. No dramatic music, no carefully crafted marketing language. Daniel stood behind a simple podium. He accepted responsibility. He'd described the incident without minimizing it. He acknowledged that policies alone could never replace judgment. Most importantly, he spoke directly to his own employees. If you ever believe a passenger is being treated unfairly, I expect you to speak. He paused. Following procedure will never excuse abandoning humanity. The statement spread quickly. Not because it was perfect, because it sounded honest. That evening, the flight attendant who had apologized to Ethan watched the speech from her apartment. She sat alone at her kitchen table. The television reflected softly against the window. When Daniel finished speaking, she reached for her laptop. She began writing. Not to the media, not to management, to every member of her crew. She described what she had seen, what she had missed, and what she would never ignore again. Before pressing send, she added one final sentence. The easiest thing I did that morning was stay quiet. It was also the thing I regret the most. She pressed send. Across the city, Ethan sat in his office with the lights turned low. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't from an executive. It wasn't from a reporter. Only one sentence. Maybe this is how change really starts. Not with one powerful man. With ordinary people deciding to do one difficult thing differently. Ethan read the message twice. Then he smiled. Not because the problem had been solved. Far from it. But because real change had finally stopped being his responsibility alone. It now belonged to everyone who had witnessed the truth and chosen not to look away again. 3 months passed. The headlines disappeared first. Television crews moved on to newer stories. Social media found another argument. The internet forgot. People did not. Inside North Star Airlines, the work continued. Training sessions replaced routine meetings. Managers sat beside frontline employees instead of above them. Outside specialists challenged old assumptions. Questions that had once been uncomfortable became expected. One morning, Daniel Harper walked into a training room without announcing himself. No cameras, no reporters. Just 30 employees seated in a circle. The 2 security officers from the airport were there. So was the flight attendant. No uniforms, no podium. Just people. An instructor asked a simple question. What makes someone belong? No one answered immediately. Finally, one of the officers spoke. I used to think experience helped me recognize problems. He looked down at his hands. Now I realize experience also taught me habits I never questioned. The room remained quiet. The flight attendant spoke next. I confused staying professional with staying silent. She smiled sadly. They aren't the same thing. Daniel listened from the back of the room. He never interrupted. For the first time in years, he wasn't there as the chief executive officer. He was there as another person trying to learn. Across town, Ethan finished reading the latest independent audit. He turned the final page and leaned back. The report wasn't perfect. It wasn't supposed to be. There were mistakes. Employees still needed coaching. Some departments were improving faster than others. But one statistic caught his attention. Reports from employees who questioned questionable passenger complaints had increased dramatically. Not because discrimination had increased. Because courage had, people were speaking. Clara knocked softly before entering. The latest audit? Ethan handed her the report. They're making progress. She smiled. I thought you'd appreciate page 27. I already did. She laughed quietly. I knew you would. She sat across from him. So what happens now? Ethan looked toward the window. Leaves drifted through the streets below. People hurried beneath them carrying coats instead of umbrellas. Now we keep watching. She tilted her head. Still no signature? Not yet. Before she could ask another question, Ethan's phone rang. Daniel Harper, Ethan answered. Good morning. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Daniel sounded different, lighter. The independent review board voted unanimously. For what? They certified that every reform we promised has been implemented. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, in reflection. Daniel continued. They also added recommendations we hadn't considered. Did you approve them? Everyone. Ethan smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. There was a brief silence. Then Daniel spoke again. I owe you something. You don't owe me anything. I do. Daniel took a slow breath. You reminded me that leadership isn't protecting a company's reputation. He paused. It's protecting the people who trust that reputation. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Sometimes silence carried more respect than words. That weekend, Ethan visited his daughter Olivia and his grandson Noah. Noah was 10 years old, curious about everything. While helping his grandfather rake leaves in the backyard, he looked up. Mom said you were on the news. Ethan smiled. For a little while. Were you famous? No. Were you in trouble? Ethan rested the rake against the fence. Not exactly. Noah thought for a moment. Then why were people talking about you? Ethan crouched until they were eye level. They weren't really talking about me. They were talking about how people should treat each other. Noah frowned. Isn't that easy? Ethan wished it were. It should be. The boy picked up another handful of leaves. If somebody is nice to me, I should be nice back. Yes, and if somebody isn't nice, Ethan looked toward the old maple tree standing over the yard. Its branches had weathered decades of storms. You still remember they're a person. Noah considered that answer carefully, so being kind doesn't mean letting people do bad things. No, it means trying to make things better instead of making people smaller. The boy nodded. I think I understand. Ethan hoped he truly would. Because children rarely learned from speeches. They learned from examples. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the yard, Ethan watched his grandson laughing as leaves scattered through the air. He thought about the airport, the silence, the assumptions. Then he thought about the people who had chosen to change afterward, the security officers, the flight attendant, Daniel, the employees who had finally found their voices. The story had never been about one businessman in one seat. It had always been about what ordinary people decide to do after they discover they were wrong. That decision, more than any contract or investment, would shape far more lives than anyone in that first-class cabin could have imagined. 6 months later, Ethan Brooks walked through the same airport where everything had begun. No cameras followed him, no reporters waited near the entrance. To everyone around him, he was simply another traveler pulling a carry-on bag across polished floors. He preferred it that way. The terminal looked almost unchanged, the same departure boards, the same coffee stands, the same stream of people hurrying toward their gates. Yet something had changed. A young gate agent greeted every passenger with the same steady smile. An elderly couple struggled with a heavy suitcase, and before they could ask, another employee stepped forward to help. A wheelchair attendant patiently waited beside an anxious traveler until her family arrived. Small moments, easy to miss. But Ethan noticed them. Because real culture was rarely built through speeches. It was built through ordinary decisions repeated every day. As he approached security, he heard someone call his name. Mr. Brooks. He turned. It was one of the security officers from that morning months earlier. He looked nervous, older somehow. Not in age, in humility. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. Ethan smiled gently. I remember. The officer took a slow breath. I've wanted to thank you. Ethan looked surprised. Thank me? You could have demanded that I lose my job. He lowered his eyes. You didn't. Instead, you asked the company to help me become better. He paused. My daughter asked me last week why I volunteer at the community center now. A faint smile crossed his face. I told her someone reminded me that wearing a badge doesn't make you right. It only gives you a chance to do right. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ethan extended his hand. The officer shook it firmly. No bitterness remained between them, only understanding. As Ethan continued toward his gate, another familiar face approached. The flight attendant. She smiled before she spoke. I thought that was you. You look well, Ethan said. I am, she laughed softly. I've been leading our new employee orientation. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. The cover was worn from use. I keep one sentence written on the first page. She opened it. Ethan recognized the words immediately. Following procedure will never excuse abandoning humanity. She closed the notebook. We read it together every Monday. Ethan nodded. Then something good came from a difficult day. She smiled. It did. When boarding began, passengers lined up by group. An elderly black veteran stood a few places ahead of Ethan. His hands trembled slightly as he searched through his jacket for his boarding pass. Without hesitation, the gate agent smiled. Take your time, sir. No impatience, no suspicion, just respect. The man found his pass and smiled with relief. Thank you. You're very welcome. It lasted only a few seconds. Most people in line probably forgot it immediately. Ethan did not, because dignity often lived inside moments that brief. After the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Ethan looked out the window at the clouds stretching endlessly beneath the wing. His phone vibrated once. A message from Daniel Harper. The independent culture report had just been released. Customer trust had risen. Employee confidence had risen. Passenger complaints involving unfair treatment had declined. At the bottom of the report was one sentence. Culture changes when people decide that respect is no longer optional. Ethan locked his phone. He smiled quietly. The investment had finally been signed several weeks earlier. Not because the company had become perfect. No company ever would. It had been signed because people had chosen accountability over excuses and action over appearances. The most valuable return had never been financial. It had been human. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one with the most power. It is the one who refuses to let pain become hatred. The one who turns a personal injustice into an opportunity for others to be treated with greater dignity. That kind of leadership leaves a mark long after the headlines disappear. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments using these 3 words. Choose respect always.